In 107 AD, Rome threw a party that ran for 123 days. 10,000 gladiators fought in it. 11,000 animals died in it. It was paid for with the gold of a kingdom that had ceased to exist, dug out of a riverbed. The kingdom was Dacia, and the emperor who had erased it was about to take Rome to the largest it would ever be. To understand what that actually meant, you have to see the whole of it at once. At its greatest extent, in the year 117 AD, the Roman Empire covered roughly 5 million square kilometers. It stretched about 5,000 kilometers from the Atlantic cliffs of Portugal to the marshes at the head of the Persian Gulf, and about 3,500 kilometers from a stone wall in northern Britain to the first cataract of the Nile in southern Egypt. If you walked the frontier, you would cover something like 10,000 kilometers, up the Rhine through the German forests, down the length of the Danube, around the new province in the Carpathian Mountains, across the Syrian desert to the Euphrates, then west again along the edge of the Sahara to the Atlas. Inside that line lived somewhere between 60 and 70 million people. By one common estimate, that was close to a fifth of every human being alive on the planet. They were tied together by roughly 80,000 kilometers of paved highway and perhaps 400,000 kilometers of road of every kind, running from the Antonine Wall in Scotland to the caravan city of Palmyra. The Mediterranean sat in the middle of it, not as a barrier but as the empire's main street, and for the first time in recorded memory, not a single pirate fleet operated on it. A merchant could sail from Alexandria to the mouth of the Tiber in under 2 weeks with a good wind. A silver coin struck in Gaul would be taken without argument in a market in Syria. 30 legions held the edges, roughly 150,000 professional soldiers under arms, matched by about the same number of auxiliaries recruited from the conquered peoples themselves. And the whole structure had been running in one form or another for more than 8 centuries since the traditional founding of the city, and for 140 years since one man had taken sole control of it. Nobody living inside it seriously imagined it could stop. Over the next hour and a half, we are going to walk through the century when Rome worked, the murder that started it, in a bedroom with a dagger hidden in a bandage. The old senator who inherited a throne he could not hold and solved the problem by giving it away. The soldier emperor from Spain who crossed the Danube twice to destroy a kingdom that had humiliated Rome. The mountain fortress that cut its own throat rather than surrender. The largest bridge in the ancient world. The gold that paid for 123 days of games. The march to the Persian Gulf, where a Roman emperor stood on a beach and watched a ship leave for India and said out loud that he wished he were younger. The successor who walked away from all of it and drew a line across Britain in stone. The revolt in Judea that ended with a province being renamed off the map. The plague that came home with a victorious army. The barbarian breakthrough that put a hostile army inside Italy for the first time in more than 2.5 centuries. And the philosopher emperor who spent the last decade of his life in a tent, writing notes to himself about how to stay calm. If this is your kind of history, take a second and hit the like button, and subscribe if you have not already, because it genuinely does decide whether videos like this reach anybody at all. And while you watch, here is something worth arguing about. Was the Roman peace actually a golden age for the people living inside it, or was it simply the quiet that follows a very thorough conquest, paid for by everyone outside the frontier and by the millions of enslaved people inside it? Put your answer in the comments. I read them. The Golden Age began with a murder. On the 18th of September, 96 AD, the Emperor Domitian was in his bedroom in the palace on the Palatine. A steward of his own household named Stephanus had been walking around the palace for several days with his left arm wrapped in bandages, telling everyone he had injured it. There was no injury. There was a dagger. Domitian was stabbed in the groin, fought back, tried to gouge out the man's eyes, called for a weapon that his servants had already removed from under his pillow, and was finished off by a group of court officials who had joined the plot. He was 44 years old. He had ruled for 15 years. And by the end of them, he had executed enough senators that the Senate voted to erase his name from the public inscriptions of the empire and melt down his statues. That is the situation the Golden Age inherited, and it is worth being precise about why it was dangerous. The Roman Empire in 96 AD had no law of succession. None. There was no constitutional mechanism at all for choosing an emperor, because officially there was no such office. The emperor was simply a citizen who happened to hold a bundle of republican powers at once and who happened to command the loyalty of the armies. That worked as long as a dynasty produced heirs. When a dynasty ran out, the machinery had only one honest answer, which was that whoever the soldiers backed would win, and the losers would die. Rome had learned this the hard way. 27 years earlier, in the year 69 AD, when 4 men claimed the throne in 12 months, legions marched on Italy, and the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline burned down during street fighting inside the capital city. So when the conspirators killed Domitian, they had prepared. Waiting for the announcement was a senator named Marcus Cocceius Nerva. He was around 65 years old, in poor health, childless, from an old and distinguished legal family, and he had survived the reigns of Nero, Vespasian, and Domitian without ever commanding an army. That was the point. He was acceptable to the Senate because he was one of them. He was harmless enough that no faction feared him. He was old enough that everybody could see the arrangement was temporary. And within a year, he had almost lost everything. The Praetorian Guard, the 9 cohorts stationed in Rome itself, had genuinely liked Domitian, who had raised their pay. They had not been consulted about his murder. In the autumn of 97, their commander, a hard man named Casparius Aelianus, led them to the palace, surrounded it, and demanded the men who had killed the emperor. Nerva, according to the senator Cassius Dio, who wrote about a century later and whose account of these years now survives only in the summaries made by a Byzantine monk named Ixaphilinus in the 11th century, bared his own throat and told them to take him instead. It did not work. The guardsmen took the conspirators, killed them, and then forced the emperor of Rome to stand up in public and formally thank them for it. That was the moment the system nearly collapsed again. An emperor who can be humiliated by his own bodyguard cannot govern, and everyone in Rome understood it. Nerva was almost certainly going to be replaced, and the replacement was going to be chosen by soldiers on a frontier, and that meant civil war. What Nerva did instead is the reason the next 84 years happened. In October of 97, he went up to the Capitoline Hill and announced, in public, that he was adopting a son. The man he named was not a relative. He was not in Rome. He was Marcus Ulpius Traianus, and at that moment he was standing on the Rhine at Cologne as governor of Upper Germany in command of the strongest concentration of legions in the western half of the empire. Nerva did not merely name him heir. He gave him the tribunician power and command authority, which made him effectively a partner in rule, and he did it in a way that the armies could not misunderstand. The old man had looked at his own weakness, looked at the general most likely to march on him, and made that general his son instead. This is what people mean when they talk about the 5 good emperors, and it is worth stopping to define the phrase properly because it is not an ancient term. It was coined in the 16th century by the Florentine writer Niccolò Machiavelli and popularized in the 18th by the English historian Edward Gibbon. The 5 are Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, and what links them is not that they were personally virtuous, because at least 2 of them killed senators without trial. What links them is that for 4 consecutive successions, the throne passed to an adult man chosen for competence and adopted into the family, rather than to a son born into it. Machiavelli thought this was the whole secret. Gibbon agreed with him. Later historians have pointed out something awkward that we will come back to at the end, which is that not one of those 4 emperors had a surviving son to hand the empire to. The system may have been less a philosophy than a run of luck. Nerva died on the 27th of January, 98 AD, of a fever after a reign of about 16 months. The news reached Trajan in Cologne by imperial courier, carried by his own young relative Hadrian, who had ridden ahead to be the first to tell him. Trajan became sole ruler of the Roman world without a single soldier changing position. And then he did something remarkable. He did not go to Rome. He stayed on the northern frontier for more than a year, inspecting the Rhine, moving east along the Danube, walking the forts, meeting the legionary commanders, deciding what the northern defenses actually needed. He was 44 years old, born at Italica in southern Spain near modern Seville, the son of a distinguished general, and the first man to rule Rome whose family home was in a province rather than in Italy. He had spent his adult life in armies. When he finally entered the capital in 99 AD, he came through the gate on foot rather than in a chariot, walked to the Capitol, and greeted the senators one by one with a kiss, which for a Roman aristocrat meant an embrace between equals. The senator Pliny the Younger, who was there, delivered a formal speech of thanks to Trajan in the Senate in the year 100, and that speech survives. It is flattery, and Pliny was a courtier, so it has to be read carefully. But the specific things he chooses to praise tell you what the Roman governing class had been terrified of. He praises Trajan for walking rather than being carried, for letting senators speak, for not confiscating estates, for not encouraging informers, for paying his own way. The relief in it is unmistakable. These are the compliments of men who had spent 15 years wondering whether a dinner invitation was a death sentence. Trajan spent his first years doing the least glamorous and most durable work of his reign. He extended a program called the Alimenta, in which the imperial treasury lent money to Italian landowners at low interest, and the interest payments were then used to feed poor children in the towns where the loans were made. We know how it worked in detail, because two enormous bronze tablets recording the loans survive, one of them from Velea in northern Italy. Landowners mortgaged a fraction of their estates, paid 5% a year, and that money fed several hundred children per town, boys receiving slightly more than girls. It is the first large-scale state child welfare scheme in European history, and it was designed as a permanent fund rather than a gift. He built the harbor at Portus, an artificial hexagonal basin near the mouth of the Tiber, each side about 700 meters long, dug out of the ground to give Rome a port that would not silt up. A new road running from Beneventum to the heel of Italy at Brundisium, a bridge across the Tagus in Spain at Alcantara, 6 arches, the central span rising nearly 50 meters above the water, still standing, still carrying traffic, with the name of its architect, Gaius Julius Lacer, carved into a small temple at one end, aqueducts, baths, libraries, and he corresponded. We have an entire book of it, because Pliny the Younger was sent out as a special governor to the province of Bithynia and Pontus on the Black Sea coast, and he wrote to the emperor constantly. And the replies were kept. It is the single best window we have into how the Roman Empire was actually administered, and what is startling is how small the questions are. Pliny asks whether he may organize a fire brigade of 150 men in Nicomedia because a fire has just destroyed a large part of the city. Trajan says no and explains why. Any association of men, he writes, however innocent its purpose, turns into a political club. Let them keep buckets instead. And in about the year 112, Pliny writes to ask what to do about Christians. He explains that he has been executing people who admit to it on the grounds of stubbornness rather than the belief itself, and that he is uneasy because some of them recant, and because anonymous accusations are piling up. Trajan's reply is short, and it set imperial policy for over a century. Do not hunt them. Do not accept anonymous denunciations, because that sets a very bad precedent and does not belong to the spirit of our age. If they are formally accused and convicted and refuse to sacrifice, punish them. If they recant, let them go. That is the tone of the Golden Age at its best. Administrative, unexcited, faintly weary, deeply concerned with precedent. And it is worth holding it in your head, because at exactly the same moment, this same emperor was conducting one of the most destructive wars of conquest in Roman history. The reason people ask why Trajan invaded Dacia is that, on the face of it, he did not need to. The answer has 3 parts, and they are humiliation, gold, and the fact that he was a soldier. North of the lower Danube, in the mountains of what is now Romania, lay the kingdom of Dacia. It was not a tribal confederation of the kind Rome knew on the Rhine. It was a centralized state with a capital, a road network, and fortified hill towns built in a technique the Romans called murus dacicis, 2 faces of dressed limestone tied together across a rubble core by squared timber beams, producing a wall that absorbed the shock of a ram instead of shattering. The Dacians mined gold, silver, and iron, and under their king Decebalus, they had beaten Rome twice. In 86 AD, the emperor, Domitian, had sent his Praetorian prefect, Cornelius Fuscus, across the Danube with a substantial army. It was ambushed, and destroyed. Fuscus was killed. A legionary eagle was lost. 2 years later, a better general, Tedius Julianus, won a real victory in a mountain pass called Tapae. But events on the Middle Danube forced Domitian to make terms, and the terms were the problem. Rome recognized Decebalus as king, sent him an annual subsidy in cash, and, worse, supplied him with Roman military engineers and craftsmen to strengthen his fortifications. Rome was paying an enemy king protection money and building his walls for him. In the Roman political imagination, there was no arrangement more shameful, and for 13 years it stood. Trajan canceled the subsidy. The First Dacian War ran from the spring of 101 AD to the winter of 102. Trajan assembled somewhere between 9 and 12 legions or vexellations drawn from them, perhaps 150,000 men counting auxiliaries, on the south bank of the Danube in the province of Moesia. He crossed on 2 pontoon bridges, one at Laterata and one further downstream at Dirna, and the crossing is the opening scene carved on the great column he would later build in Rome. The column shows the boats lashed together, the soldiers filing over with their kits slung on carrying poles, and the river god watching from the water. From the bridgeheads, the army moved north and then east, up the Timus Valley, through the Banat, following the line of least resistance between forested ridges. This was not fast movement. Legionaries spent more time cutting road and building forts than fighting, and the column shows exactly that. Men felling timber, squaring blocks, digging ditches. Every night, the army built a marching camp. Every few days, it built something permanent. The Roman method of conquering mountains was to make them into a road. Decebalus tried diplomacy first, sending envoys, including a delegation of the long-haired Dacian nobility called the Piliati after the felt caps they wore. Trajan refused terms. So the Dacians fell back to the place where they had beaten Rome before, and where Rome had beaten them, a pass in the mountains called Tapae, the gate into the heart of the kingdom. The ground at Tapae did the tactical thinking for both sides. The valley narrows between wooded slopes, so a large army cannot deploy on a broad front and must feed itself into the pass in a column. Whoever holds the high ground on either side can strike downhill into the flank of that column while it is still strung out. Decebalus put his infantry across and above the valley floor, with Sarmatian and Bastarnian allies alongside them, and waited for the Romans to commit. Trajan advanced with the legions in the center, auxiliary cohorts on the wings, and a screen of Moorish light cavalry under a Berber prince named Lucius Quietus, who rode without saddles and would become one of the most feared commanders in the army. Behind the front lines came the artillery, bolt-shooting engines mounted on carts, which is one of the details the column preserves. The Dacians came down the slope. Their principal weapon was the Falx, a two-handed blade curved forward like a sickle with the cutting edge on the inside, swung overhead so that it came down past the top rim of a shield and into the head, neck, or arm behind it. It was heavy enough to split a helmet. Roman equipment had never been designed against it, and we know how badly it worked because we can see the response in the archaeology. Roman helmets from this period start appearing, with iron crossbars riveted over the skull. Segmented iron arm guards, the manica, previously worn mainly by gladiators, start appearing in legionary contexts, and the sculptures at Adamclisi show ordinary soldiers wearing them on the sword arm. An empire that changed its standard equipment did so because men were being killed in a specific way. The Roman line bent under the downhill charge and held. It held because of the thing the legion was actually for, which was not individual combat, but replacement. The front rank fought, tired, and stepped back through the ranks behind, while fresh men stepped forward, over and over, for as long as the officers kept the sequence going. The Dacian charge had weight at the moment of impact, and nothing behind it. As the momentum of the slope ran out, the auxiliaries on the wings worked around the shoulders of the pass and began shooting into the flanks of the Dacian mass, and the artillery on the carts started dropping bolts into men who had nowhere to spread out. Then a storm broke over the valley. Both the column and the later summaries describe it, and the Dacians, whose religion held that the storm was the voice of their god, appear to have read it as a judgment. The Dacian army broke and got away into the hills, which is the crucial point. Tapae was a Roman victory, and not a decisive one. The casualties on the Roman side were severe enough. that when the bandages ran out, Trajan is said to have torn up his own clothing to make more. And afterwards, he ordered an altar built on the ground and annual funeral rites performed there for the dead. Emperors did not do that for cheap wins. Decebalus then did the intelligent thing, which was to attack somewhere else entirely. In the winter of 101, while the Roman field army was deep in the mountains, a Dacian and Sarmatian force crossed the frozen lower Danube and drove into the Roman province of Moesia behind them, hitting the undefended forts and towns along the Black Sea coast. Among them were Roxolani heavy cavalry, riders and horses both armored head to foot in scale, a formation the column depicts with real attention because Roman audiences found it alien and frightening. Trajan had to turn his whole army around, march it back south, recross the Danube, and fight a second campaign in his own territory in midwinter. The battle that resulted was fought near a place now called Adamclisi in southern Romania, and it was brutal enough that Trajan later put up 2 monuments on the site. One was a vast circular trophy, faced with carved panels, showing legionaries and auxiliaries fighting Dacians and Sarmatians about 40 meters across. The other was an altar carved with the names of the Roman dead, arranged by unit and by hometown, close to 3,800 of them. It is the only monument of its kind from the Roman world, a casualty list on public display, and it exists because those men died defending a province rather than taking someone else's. By the summer of 102, with the Roman army back in the mountains and closing on the capital, Decebalus asked for terms and got them. He surrendered his siege engines, handed over the Roman engineers who had been working for him, gave up deserters, agreed to demolish his fortifications, and accepted Roman garrisons in his territory. He kept his throne. Trajan took the name Dacicus, went home, and celebrated a triumph. Everyone involved understood that it was an intermission. Between the 2 wars, Trajan built a bridge. It was designed by a Greek architect from Syria named Apollodorus of Damascus, and it was put up between 103 and 105 AD at Drobeta, where the Danube runs wide and slow below the gorge of the Iron Gates. It was roughly 1,100 meters long. 20 stone piers stood in the riverbed, each one built inside a temporary dam of driven piles that had to be pumped dry before masons could work, and each one carrying a timber arch. Cassius Dio, who saw the piers still standing in his own lifetime a century later, recorded their dimensions and said flatly that of all Trajan's achievements, this was the greatest. For more than 1,000 years, it was the longest arch bridge in the world. The strategic message was not subtle. A pontoon bridge is a decision you can reverse. A stone and timber bridge with 20 piers sunk into the bed of the Danube is a statement that the army is coming back, that it will keep coming back, and that the river is no longer a border. Decebalus read it correctly. He began rebuilding his fortifications in violation of the treaty, took in Roman deserters, recruited among his neighbors, and sent agents into Roman territory. According to Dio, he tried to have Trajan assassinated, and he seized a former Roman consul, Gnaeus Pompeius Longinus, by inviting him to talks and then arresting him, hoping to trade him for a withdrawal. Longinus obtained poison from a servant on the pretense of reconciling with the king and killed himself to remove the bargaining chip. In June of 105 AD, the Senate declared Decebalus an enemy of the Roman people, and Trajan went back across his bridge. The Second Dacian War was a war of demolition. There was no single decisive field battle because Decebalus had learned not to offer one. Instead, the Roman army moved up the valleys in converging columns and took the fortified hill towns of the Orasti Mountains one after another, in order. Costesti first, then Bliderou, then the fortress on the Red Rock at Piatra Rossi, each one a walled enclosure on a summit connected to the next by ridge paths, each one requiring roads to be cut so that artillery and supplies could be dragged up behind the infantry. The column in Rome shows the sequence in detail, and it shows what happened to the population. Columns of prisoners, herds driven off, settlements burning. The last of them was the capital, Sarmizegetusa Regia, standing at about 1,200 meters above sea level on a terraced ridge, defended by the Murus Dacicus walls and approached along a single narrow spine of ground. Inside the fortifications were the residential terraces, the workshops, the water system, and the sacred precinct. A set of rectangular and circular sanctuaries, laid out in rows of limestone and andesite column bases whose purpose is still argued over. There was no assault up that ridge, because there did not need to be. The Romans cut roads to the summit, built camps that pinned the approaches, and then found the thing that decides most sieges. Sarmizegetusa did not have springs inside the walls. Its water came from higher ground through a pipeline of fitted ceramic pipes. The Romans cut it. What followed is one of the ugliest scenes on Trajan's column, and the carving is unusually careful about it. The fortress burned. In the sculpture, Dacian nobles are shown gathered around a large cauldron, some drinking from cups, some already lying on the ground, while others reach for the vessel. It is a mass suicide by poison. The people who had built a state, capable of humiliating Rome twice, chose not to be paraded through it. Decebalus was not among them. He broke out to the north with a small mounted escort and rode for the mountains, hoping to reach the tribes beyond the Carpathians and start again. He was hunted through the hills by Roman cavalry, and here we know the ending not from a historian but from a tombstone, which is one of the strangest and best pieces of evidence to survive from the ancient world. At Philippi in Macedonia, a retired cavalryman named Tiberius Claudius Maximus set up his own funerary monument and had his career carved on it. It records that he was decorated by Trajan in the Dacian War, that he was promoted to a scouting command, and that he captured Decebalus and brought his head to the emperor at a place called Ranistorum. The stone even carries a small relief of the moment. A Roman rider bearing down on a bearded man who has fallen with his horse and is putting a curved blade to his own throat. The head and right hand of the king of Dacia were carried to Rome and thrown down the Gemonian stairs, the flight of steps beside the Capitoline where the bodies of executed criminals were displayed. Then the Romans went looking for the treasury. The story, preserved by Dio, is that Decebalus had diverted the river Sargetia with a work gang of prisoners, buried the royal gold and silver in the exposed bed, restored the river over it, and killed the laborers. A Dacian noble named Decebalus, taken prisoner, told the Romans where to dig. How much came out of Dacia is genuinely disputed, and you should treat the ancient numbers with suspicion. A late Byzantine writer, drawing on a lost work by Trajan's own doctor, gives figures of 5 million pounds of gold and 10 million pounds of silver, which would be a physically absurd quantity, more gold than the entire Roman world is likely to have held. A widely used correction assumes a copying error and divides by 10, giving something in the order of 165 tons of gold and 300 tons of silver, which is still enormous and just about credible for a kingdom sitting on the richest gold deposits in Europe. Whatever the true figure, the economic effect is visible in the coinage and in the building program. The mines at Alburnus Maior in the Dacian mountains were immediately put back into production under Roman management. And we know how that was organized because dozens of wooden writing tablets coated in wax were found preserved in the flooded galleries, recording labor contracts, loan agreements, the sale of a slave boy, and the constitution of a burial club, all written in ordinary workaday Latin by ordinary people. That is the triumph this story opened on. Trajan's celebration in the summer of 107 AD ran for 123 days, and Dio's summary gives 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 animals killed in the games. Dacia was annexed as a province, and the destruction of the native population and the settlement of colonists brought in from across the empire was so thorough that a 4th century official named Eutropius, writing a short history of Rome, could describe the province as having been repopulated from the whole Roman world. It is the reason a Romance language is spoken in that part of Europe today. And with the proceeds, Trajan built the most ambitious complex in the history of the city. His forum, dedicated in 112 AD, involved cutting away the shoulder of the Quirinal Hill and covering an area larger than any previous imperial forum, with a basilica, 2 libraries, 1 Greek and 1 Latin, and the multi-story brick and concrete complex of halls and shops now called Trajan's Market carved into the excavated hillside. In the middle, he set a column. Trajan's column still stands. The shaft is about 30 meters high, built from around 20 drums of marble with a spiral staircase of 185 steps cut through the inside. Around the outside runs a continuous carved band roughly 200 meters long, winding 23 times from bottom to top, showing both Dacian wars in sequence with something over 2,500 human figures. Its base was designed as a tomb, and Trajan's ashes were placed in it, a formal violation of the ancient rule against burial inside the sacred boundary of the city, and a measure of what the Senate thought of him. What is remarkable about the column, and what most people miss, is what it chooses to show. Out of that entire 200-meter frieze, only a modest fraction depicts fighting. The overwhelming majority shows work. Soldiers building, marching, chopping, surveying, addressing, sacrificing, ferrying supplies. It is a monument to logistics. The Roman state understood perfectly well what its actual advantage was. So how big did the Roman Empire actually get? The answer is that it reached its maximum in the last 3 years of Trajan's life, and it happened in the east, and it did not last. In 113 AD, the king of Parthia, Osroes, deposed the king of Armenia and installed a nephew of his own named Parthomasirus without consulting Rome. Armenia had been a shared buffer for over 50 years under an arrangement in which Parthia chose the king and Rome crowned him. Osroes had broken the arrangement. It was a genuine provocation, and it was also exactly the excuse to a 60-year-old soldier emperor with a full treasury and a reputation to complete had been waiting for. Trajan left Rome in the autumn of 113, sailed to Greece, crossed Asia Minor, and wintered at Antioch in Syria, the third city of the empire. In the spring of 114, he marched northeast into Armenia. There was almost no fighting. Parthomasirus met him at a town called Elegia, walked into the Roman camp, and performed the ritual that had worked before, taking the diadem from his own head and laying it at the emperor's feet, expecting it to be handed back. Trajan did not hand it back. He annexed Armenia as a Roman province and sent the young king away under escort. Parthomasirus did not survive the journey. From Armenia, the army turned south. In 115, it came down into Upper Mesopotamia and took the cities along the northern route in sequence: Nisibis, Batnae, Singara, Adonistre, driving a wedge between the Parthian heartland and the Roman east. The territory was organized as the province of Mesopotamia, and a further region east of the Tigris was declared the province of Assyria. Rome now had provinces named after Assyria and Babylon. In December of 115, while the emperor wintered at Antioch, an enormous earthquake leveled much of the city and killed the consul of that year. Trajan escaped through a window, and the story told afterwards was that a man of superhuman size led him out. He spent the following days camped in the open with everyone else while aftershocks continued. In 116, he made the deepest thrust any Roman army ever made into Asia. He moved down the Euphrates by boat and by road, then had his fleet dismantled, dragged overland to the Tigris on rollers, and reassembled, an operation that only works with a professional engineer corps and total command of the road network behind you. He crossed under fire, took Seleucia, and then took Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, capturing the king's daughter and his golden throne. Babylon surrendered. And then he kept going, all the way down the Tigris to the Delta, to the port of Charax Spasinu at the head of the Persian Gulf. There is a moment recorded there that is worth sitting with. Trajan, aged 63, stood on the shore, watched a merchant ship setting out for India, and said that if he were still a young man, he would be crossing over to the Indians. He had reached water that no Roman army had ever reached, and the thing he felt was not triumph but the shortness of his own life. At that moment, the Roman Empire was the largest it would ever be, and it was already coming apart behind him. While the field army sat on the Persian Gulf, the newly conquered cities of Mesopotamia rose in revolt, more or less simultaneously. Garrisons were killed, communications along the rivers were cut. Trajan had to turn around and fight his way back up the country he had just taken, retaking Seleucia and burning it. He tried to stabilize the situation politically by crowning a Parthian prince, Parthomaspates, as a client king of Parthia in a ceremony at Ctesiphon, in effect admitting that direct annexation had failed. Then he laid siege to Hatra, a caravan city in the northern Mesopotamian desert ringed by a circular wall, in country with no water and no shade. Dio describes flies swarming on the food, savage heat, hailstorms, and men collapsing. Trajan rode near the walls without his imperial dress so that he would not be recognized, and a missile killed a cavalryman beside him. Hatra held. Rome abandoned the siege. And at the same time, in 115 and 116, a massive revolt broke out among the Jewish communities of the eastern Mediterranean, in Cyrene in North Africa, in Egypt, in Cyprus, and in Mesopotamia. It is usually called the Kitos War, after Lucius Quietus, the Moorish cavalry commander from the Dacian campaign who was sent to crush the Mesopotamian rising. Dio's summaries give casualty figures in the hundreds of thousands, numbers almost no modern historian accepts as literal, but which indicate the scale of the shock. Papyri from Egypt show villages abandoned and land going out of cultivation for years afterwards. The Jewish community of Alexandria, one of the largest and oldest in the world, was effectively destroyed. Trajan, ill and probably having suffered a stroke, gave up and started for home. He got as far as Selinus on the southern coast of Asia Minor and died there in early August of 117 AD, age 63, in a town that was afterwards renamed Trajanopolis. He had ruled for 19 years. The Senate later formalized a title for him that had begun as an informal one, Optimus, the best. And for the next 300 years, the standard blessing offered to a new Roman emperor at his accession was that he should be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. Which brings us to the question that sits at the exact center of this story. Why did Hadrian give up everything Trajan had conquered? Start with how he came to power, because it was not clean. Publius Aelius Hadrianus was Trajan's first cousin once removed, from the same town of Italica in Spain, married to Trajan's great niece. And at the moment of the emperor's death, he was governor of Syria in command of the army's rear. Trajan had never formally adopted him. Then, 2 days after the death, a document of adoption was produced, signed by the Empress Plotina rather than by Trajan. The only witnesses to the emperor's final days were Plotina, her niece Matidia, and the Praetorian prefect Adrianus, all of them Hadrian's supporters. Dio, whose own father governed the neighboring province of Cilicia and made inquiries locally, states as a matter of fact that the death was concealed for a few days while the arrangements were made. Whatever the truth, Hadrian's first year included the deaths of 4 senior consular senators, among them Lucius Quietus and Cornelius Palma, killed on the orders of the Senate for an alleged conspiracy while Hadrian was away from Rome. He swore for the rest of his life that he had not ordered it, and nobody in the Senate ever quite believed him. It poisoned his relationship with that body permanently, and it is a large part of the reason the surviving written portrait of him is so hostile. But the strategic decision was correct, and here is the case for it. Trajan's eastern conquests had produced provinces that revolted the moment the field army moved past them, that could not be garrisoned without permanently stationing legions 1,000 kilometers beyond the nearest secure base, and that had no defensible frontier at their eastern edge. Only open country running away toward Iran. Mesopotamia was not a border. It was an invitation to repeat the campaign every generation. Meanwhile, every legion sent east was a legion not on the Danube, where the Sarmatian tribes were already probing, or on the Rhine, or in Britain. So Hadrian, within months of taking power, withdrew from Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Armenia, returned Armenia to client kingdom status, and reverted the eastern frontier to the Euphrates line his predecessors had held. He considered abandoning Dacia too, and was talked out of it, though he pulled back from the exposed lowland areas and split the province into more manageable commands. He gave up the greatest conquests in Roman history in about a year, and the Senate hated him for it, and the empire survived another 3 centuries partly because of it. Then he did something more interesting than giving territory back. He decided what a frontier was. Before Hadrian, the Roman border was conceptually a zone rather than a line, a space of influence that the army moved through and would eventually push further out. Hadrian made it a physical thing you could stand on. In Germany, between the Upper Rhine and the Danube, he had a continuous palisade of split oak posts driven into the ground for hundreds of kilometers. Backed by a chain of watchtowers within signaling distance of each other and larger forts behind them, the whole system, eventually running about 550 kilometers with something like 900 towers. In North Africa, A Dacian wall system controlled the routes used by transhuman herders. In Syria, a road with forts along it. And in Britain, he built the thing that carries his name. Hadrian came to Britain in 122 AD, and work started that year. The wall runs about 117 kilometers, 80 Roman miles, from Wallsend on the River Tyne in the east to Bowness on the Solway Firth in the west, coast to coast across the narrowest part of the island. The eastern stretch was built in stone, about 3 meters wide and probably 4 to 5 meters high. Along it, at intervals of 1 Roman mile, stood a small fortified gateway, a mile castle, and between each pair of mile castles stood 2 turrets, so that the entire length was under continuous observation. In front was a ditch, and behind it, a second enormous earthwork, called the Vallum. 16 forts were eventually built astride it. 3 legions did the construction, and their working parties left inscriptions recording which century built which stretch, so that you can still read on the stones the equivalent of a signature at the end of a shift. It was never intended to stop an army. It was too thin for that, and there were too many gates. What it did was make movement legible. Nobody could bring cattle, goods, or armed men across northern Britain without being seen, counted, taxed, or turned back. It converted an ungoverned zone into a customs border with a permanent audience of soldiers. That is the real innovation of Hadrian's reign, and it is the moment Rome stopped being an expanding empire and became a defended one. Hadrian himself did not sit behind it. He spent more than half of his 21-year reign outside Italy, and he did not travel like an emperor. He walked with the troops, bareheaded in heat and cold, ate camp rations in front of them, and, according to the same hostile sources that call him arrogant, could name individual veterans. From 121, he moved through Gaul and the German provinces, then to Britain, then south to Spain, then east through Asia Minor to Syria and Athens, where he was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. Then out again to North Africa in 128, where he inspected the 3rd Legion at Lambaesis in the Algerian desert and delivered a speech assessing their exercises unit by unit, which the legion was so pleased with that they carved the whole thing onto a stone pillar, and it survives. It is the only surviving text of a Roman emperor speaking directly to his soldiers about their professional performance, and it is full of specifics, praise for a cavalry unit that built a stone wall quickly, a mild note that throwing javelins in that heat is harder than it looks. Then east again, to Greece, Asia, Syria, Arabia, Judea, and in 130 to Egypt, where he sailed up the Nile. And in October of that year, on that river, his companion Antoninus, a young Greek from Bithynia, drowned. The circumstances were never explained. Hadrian's grief was so public and so far outside Roman convention that it embarrassed the elite for centuries. He founded a city on the bank where it happened, Antinopolis, had the young man declared a god, and had portraits distributed on a scale that means that today, of all the people of the ancient world, only Augustus and Hadrian himself survive in more sculpted likenesses. What Hadrian built in stone was, if anything, more radical than what he built on the frontiers. He rebuilt the Pantheon in Rome as a domed rotunda whose interior is a perfect sphere, 43 meters across and 43 meters high, with a circular opening nearly 9 meters wide open to the sky. It is made of unreinforced concrete, with the aggregate deliberately graded from heavy basalt at the base to light volcanic pumice at the crown so that the dome gets lighter as it rises. It is still, after more than 18 centuries, the largest unreinforced concrete dome ever built. At Tivoli outside Rome, he laid out a villa covering something like 120 hectares, an entire landscape of pools, dining pavilions, and libraries reproducing places he had seen on his travels. In Athens, he finished a temple that had stood unfinished for 6 centuries, and in Judea, he started a war that ended a nation. Judea had already revolted twice, in the Great War of 66 to 73 AD that destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and again in the diaspora rising under Trajan. Hadrian's contribution was to decide what should stand on the ruins. He refounded Jerusalem as a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, laid out on a standard grid with a temple to Jupiter on the site of the Jewish sanctuary. Our sources also report a ban on circumcision, though whether it came before the revolt as a cause or after it as a punishment is argued over. Either way, the offense was total. The city was to be rebuilt as somebody else's. The revolt began in 132 AD under a commander called Simon Bar Kokhba, known to his followers as Bar Kokhba, son of the star, a messianic title endorsed by the most respected rabbi of the age, Akiva ben Joseph. And unlike almost every other ancient rebellion, we can hear this one in its own voice, because in the 1950s archaeologists working in caves above a ravine called Nahal Hever, in the cliffs west of the Dead Sea, found the refugees' possessions, baskets, keys, a woman's mirror, sandals, and letters. Actual dispatches signed by Simon himself, giving orders about supplies, about the palm branches and citrons needed for a religious festival, about arresting men who had failed to report. He signs himself Prince over Israel. The rebels also struck their own coinage, hammering their designs directly over circulating Roman coins so that the emperor's face was beaten flat, and dating them to year 1 of the redemption of Israel. The rebels held their ground for over 3 years, and they did it by refusing to fight the way Rome wanted. They avoided open battle entirely, operating from a network of underground complexes cut into the soft limestone beneath villages, chambers connected by crawlways too narrow for an armored man to move through quickly, with concealed entrances inside houses. Hundreds of these systems have been excavated. Hadrian had to send for his best general, Sextus Julius Severus, and bring him all the way from Britain. Severus made no attempt to force a decision. He divided the country into sectors, cut the rebels into isolated pockets, blockaded each pocket, and starved it. Dio says explicitly that Severus did not dare attack them in the open, but shut them up and cut off supplies until he could crush them without serious loss to his own men. It is a strategy of attrition, and it worked, and it left the country wrecked. The end came at Beitar, a fortified town on a spur of rock about 11 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem, protected by steep ravines on 3 sides and reachable only along a narrow saddle. The Roman lines are still visible on the ground, a circumvallation wall thrown around the hill, and camps sited to watch the approaches, with a ramp built up against the one accessible face. Inside were the last of the fighters, and a large civilian population. There was no relief force, because there was nothing left to relieve them. Beitar fell in the summer, probably of 135 AD, and Jewish tradition places it on the 9th of the month of Av, the same date on which both temples were said to have been destroyed. The figures Dio gives are 50 fortified places, and 985 villages destroyed, and 580,000 killed in raids alone. And again, treat them as an ancient impression of scale rather than a count. What is not in doubt is the aftermath. Survivors were sold in such numbers that the slave market at Hebron collapsed in price. Jews were barred from Jerusalem. And Hadrian took the province of Judea and renamed it Syria, Palestina, after the Philistines, deliberately erasing the connection between the people and the land in the official geography of the empire. It is one of the very few occasions in Roman history when a province was renamed as an act of punishment. Rome's own losses were heavy enough that when Hadrian sent his report to the Senate, he is said to have left out the customary opening formula stating that he and the army were well. Hadrian came home ill and spent his last years at Baiae on the Bay of Naples with what was probably heart failure, in enough pain that he repeatedly asked servants and doctors to kill him and had to be prevented. He wrote a short poem addressed to his own soul, calling it a small, wandering, charming thing, his body's guest and companion, and asking where it was about to go, pale and stiff and stripped of its jokes. It is the only piece of writing by a Roman emperor that reads like a man alone in a room at night. The succession he arranged was elaborate, and it was the last act of the adoptive system. His first choice, Lucius Sionius Commodus, died of a hemorrhage on the 1st of January, 138 AD. Hadrian then chose a wealthy, mild, 51-year-old senator named Titus Aurelius Fulvus Boionius Arius Antoninus on one condition. Antoninus had to adopt 2 boys himself on the same day. One was the dead man's son, Lucius Verus. The other was Hadrian's own great-nephew by marriage, a serious 17-year-old named Marcus Annius Verus, whom Hadrian had nicknamed Verissimus, the most truthful. Hadrian died in July of 138. He had, in a single afternoon, arranged the next 42 years. Antoninus Pius ruled for 23 of them, from 138 to 161. And his reign is the hardest part of this story to narrate, because almost nothing happened. He never left Italy once as emperor. He fought no wars in person. He built comparatively little in Rome. The historian who wants drama has almost nothing to work with, and that is precisely the achievement. What he did was govern. He restored relations with the Senate that Hadrian had wrecked, and got the title Pius for insisting the Senate deify Hadrian against its will, or possibly for supporting his aged father-in-law. Since ancient sources disagree, he kept taxes low, canceled arrears, subsidized the corn supply, paid for the games himself, and left the imperial treasury with an enormous surplus. One figure suggesting something in the order of 675 million denarii, which would be roughly 2.5 years of the entire imperial budget sitting unspent. He extended the Alimenta and founded a new fund for orphaned girls, named after his late wife Faustina. Under him, and under a jurist named Salvius Julianus, the annually reissued edict that governed Roman civil procedure was fixed in permanent form, the moment Roman law began becoming the codified system that later fed most of the legal traditions of Europe and Latin America. There was frontier fighting, done by governors. In Britain, the army pushed north again around 142 and built a second wall of turf on a stone base, 63 kilometers across the narrow neck between the Forth and the Clyde, the Antonine Wall, which was held for about 20 years and then quietly abandoned. There was trouble in Mauritania, in Dacia, in Egypt, in Greece. None of it reached the center. In 148, Rome celebrated its 900th birthday with games. A Greek orator named Aelius Aristides came to the city around this period and praised it in terms that, whatever the flattery, described something real, a world in which the fortifications had been moved to the edges and the interior had simply stopped needing walls. Antoninus died in March of 161 at his villa outside Rome, aged 74, after a fever brought on by too much Alpine cheese at dinner. The officer of the watch came for the night's password. The emperor gave it as equanimitas, evenness of mind, turned over and died. His adopted son, Marcus Aurelius, aged 39, immediately did something no Roman had ever done. He went to the Senate and insisted that his adoptive brother Lucius Verus be made emperor alongside him with equal formal powers. For the first time, the Roman world had two emperors at once. It was a solution to the problem of an empire that had become too large for one man to be in two crises at the same time, and within months, it was needed. The Parthians had invaded Armenia. The governor of Cappadocia, Marcus Sedatius Severianus, marched to meet them, was surrounded at Elegeia, lost his entire force including a legion, and killed himself. Parthian forces then pushed into Syria and beat the Roman army there as well. It was the worst eastern defeat in a century. Verus went east as the imperial presence. The actual campaign was run by professionals, above all Avidius Cassius, a Syrian-born general of formidable ability. From 163, the Romans retook Armenia and burned its capital Artaxata. In 165, they went down the Euphrates, stormed the caravan city of Dura Europos, and drove into Mesopotamia, taking Seleucia and burning the royal palace at Ctesiphon, exactly as Trajan had. It was a total victory, and both emperors took the title Parthicus, and the army brought something home with it. It appeared first at Seleucia in the winter of 165, and it moved west with the returning troops along the roads that were the empire's greatest asset, through Syria into Asia Minor, to Rome by 166, and out to the Rhine and the Danube garrisons after that. We call it the Antonine Plague. The physician Galen of Pergamum, who was in Rome when it arrived and who is the best medical witness of the ancient world, described the course of it: fever, foul breath, black stools, and after about 9 days, a rash of dark pustules covering the whole body, which in survivors scabbed and fell away, leaving scars. Most modern specialists think this describes smallpox, though the evidence does not permit certainty and no ancient bodies have yielded a pathogen. How many it killed is one of the genuine open arguments in Roman history, and we will come back to it. What is not disputed is that it kept coming back, in waves, for at least 15 years. and that it hit an unusually vulnerable target, an urban, densely settled, highly connected population with no previous exposure and no concept of contagion beyond corrupted air. So stop the chronology here, at the moment the plague enters, and look at what it was entering. What was daily life in the Roman Empire at its peak actually like, and how do we know? We know partly because of a hill in Rome made of garbage. Monte Testaccio stands about 35 meters high and roughly a kilometer around, and it is composed entirely of broken pottery, the deliberately smashed remains of somewhere around 53 million large ceramic jars, most of them a squat globular type used to ship olive oil from southern Spain. They were smashed because oil soaks into clay and turns rancid, so the jars could not be reused, and the dump was managed, with the sherds stacked in terraces and limes spread to control the smell. Many of them still carry painted inscriptions recording the weight of the jar empty, the weight of the oil, the name of the shipper, and the name of the official who checked it. A single city on the Tiber ate through that much oil from one region of Spain and kept the paperwork. We know because of the tableware. Across the Western Empire in this period, ordinary households ate off glossy red slipware, made in factory conditions and stamped with the maker's name. At La Grau-Fesenc in southern Gaul, the potters kept tallies on broken sherds of what went into each firing, and those tallies record single kiln loads of tens of thousands of vessels. One of them, approaching 30,000 pieces. That pottery has been dug up on farms in Britain, in forts, on the Danube, in villages, in Morocco. A farmer in Northumberland was eating off industrially produced tableware shipped from France, and it was cheap enough that it was not worth mentioning. We know because of a rubbish pit in northern Britain. At the fort of Vindolanda, just south of where Hadrian's wall would later run, waterlogged oxygen-free mud preserved hundreds of thin wooden leaves covered in ink writing, thrown out around the year 100. They are ordinary correspondence. A commander's wife named Claudia Severa writes to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina, inviting her to a birthday party and adding a line of greeting in her own hand, which makes it the earliest known writing in Latin by a woman. Someone writes to a soldier to say that he is sending socks, 2 pairs of sandals, and underpants. There is a strength report for a cohort listing how many men are sick and how many have eye inflammation. There is a memo in which an officer refers to the locals with a contemptuous slang term. There is an inventory of the pepper in the kitchen. The pepper is the point. Pepper grows in southern India, and it was in a soldier's kitchen at the edge of Scotland because a shipping route was running from Egyptian Red Sea ports across the Indian Ocean on the monsoon, with, by one ancient account, something like 120 ships a year making the crossing. A surviving business document, a papyrus recording a loan against a single cargo coming back from the Indian port of Muziris, values that one shipload after tax at around 7 million sesterces, which was enough to make 7 men rich enough to sit in the Roman Senate. The elder Pliny complained that India, China, and Arabia between them drained 100 million sesterces a year out of the empire. Hordes of Roman gold coin turn up in southern India, and a Chinese court record notes that in the year corresponding to 166 AD, an embassy claiming to come from the king of Dacian, named Andun, which is how a Chinese scribe would write Antoninus, arrived by sea in the far south of the Han Empire, bearing ivory and tortoiseshell. We know because of ice in Greenland. Cores drilled out of the ice sheet and out of alpine glaciers trap airborne pollution layer by layer, and the lead and copper content of the air over Europe rises through the late Republic, peaks in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and then falls away, not to be matched again until the Industrial Revolution roughly 1700 years later. That lead came from smelting silver in Spain and Britain to make coins. The Roman economy is visible in the atmosphere. So the ordinary experience. In a decent-sized provincial town in the year 160, you would drink water delivered by aqueduct to public fountains. You would wash in a heated public bath, which cost a fraction of a day's wage and which the whole town used, and Rome itself eventually counted 11 monumental bath complexes and hundreds of smaller ones. You could buy fish sauce from Spain, wine from Italy or Gaul, glass from Syria, and lamps stamped with a maker's name from a factory 2 provinces away. If you lived in Rome, and you were a male citizen on the register, you collected a free monthly ration of grain. part of the 200,000 tons or so shipped in every year from Egypt and North Africa. And you probably lived in an apartment in a brick and concrete block 5 or 6 stories high, on an upper floor if you were poor, because the desirable flats were the ones you did not have to climb to. And you would very likely be dead before 40. Life expectancy at birth across the Roman world was somewhere around 25 years, and that figure is dominated by children. Something like a third of infants did not reach their first birthday, and about half of everyone born did not reach 10. Malaria was endemic in central Italy. Tuberculosis was everywhere. A woman who survived to adulthood faced a substantial chance of dying in childbirth, and the funerary inscriptions show it. Husbands recording wives dead at 19, at 22, after one child. And a large fraction of the people making all this work were owned. Estimates put the enslaved population of the empire somewhere around 10 to 15% overall, and considerably higher in Italy, perhaps a fifth to a third. They mined the silver that shows up in the ice cores, rowed nothing but worked the docks that unloaded the oil jars, staffed the kitchens, kept the accounts, and were subject to torture as a matter of standard legal procedure when giving evidence. The Golden Age was extremely comfortable, and the comfort was distributed by a rule that had nothing to do with merit. That is the world the plague walked into, and in the same years, the northern frontier broke. The pressure on the Danube had been building for a generation, as peoples further north and east moved and pushed the tribes along the river into the Roman frontier ahead of them. In 166, the Langobardian Obii crossed into Pannonia and were driven back. 11 tribes sent envoys asking for land inside the empire. Rome, with its best troops still returning from Parthia and its garrisons thinning under the plague, had very little to offer. Around the year 170, the frontier failed outright. Marcomanni and Quadi crossed the Danube in force, destroyed a Roman army, and came south through the Alpine passes into Italy. They sacked the town of Opitergium and laid siege to Aquileia at the head of the Adriatic, the gateway to the whole Italian north. At the same moment, a people called the Costobosi raided down through the Balkans into Greece and burned the sanctuary at Eleusis, one of the holiest places in the Greek world. For the first time in more than 260 years, since the Cimbri and Teutones, a hostile army was operating inside Italy. The emperor's response was improvised and revealing. There was no money, and there were no men. Marcus refused to raise taxes on provinces already ruined by disease, so instead he held a public auction in the Forum of Trajan that ran for 2 months, selling off the contents of the imperial palaces, gold vessels, crystal, his wife's silk and jeweled robes, to raise cash. He raised new legions. He enrolled gladiators as soldiers, which nearly caused a riot because it emptied the arenas. He armed slaves and bandits from the Balkans and police auxiliaries from the Greek cities, and he hired German mercenaries to fight other Germans. He moved the imperial headquarters permanently north, to Carnuntum on the Danube near modern Vienna, and to Sirmium, and he stayed there, on and off, for the rest of his life. Aquileia held. The invaders were caught on their way home and destroyed, and from about 172 the Romans went back across the river and stayed across it, fighting a grinding, unglamorous, year-after-year campaign in the forests and marshes of what is now Slovakia, Hungary, and the Czech lands. One of those winters produced the strangest battle in Roman military writing. The Iazyges were a Sarmatian people living on the plain between the Danube and the Dacian mountains, and they fought as heavy cavalry, riders in scale armor on armored horses. In the winter of about 173, pressed by Roman columns, they pulled back across the Danube, which had frozen hard, and waited on the ice. The ground was the whole plan. The Iazyges knew the ice. Their horses were trained to move on it, and their tactics assumed it. A Roman legionary in hobnailed boots, carrying a shield and wearing 30 or more kilograms of equipment, could not stand up on it, let alone hold a line. So they let the Romans come out onto the river, and then charged, expecting to hit a formation that was already falling over. What happened instead is recorded by Cassius Dio, and it is the sort of thing that is too odd to be invented. The Romans halted on the ice and made a footing. Each man laid his shield flat on the frozen surface and planted one foot on it, so that the boot gripped leather and wood rather than ice, and braced the other foot behind him. Then, as the cavalry came in, They did not try to receive the charge with spears in the ordinary way. They grabbed. They took hold of bridles, shields, spear shafts, anything attached to a rider, and pulled, using the enemy's own momentum and the frictionless ground against him. Armored horses went down. Armored men on the ice could not get up quickly. The fighting turned into wrestling, and Dio says the Romans were the better wrestlers, and that when a Roman was dragged down, he pulled his opponent underneath him with his teeth if he had to. The Iazyges lost the engagement, and more importantly, lost the belief that the river protected them in any season. Another moment from those campaigns entered legend on all sides. A Roman force, including the 12th Legion, was surrounded by the Quadi in dry country and cut off from water, exhausted and dying of thirst, and then a sudden violent storm broke, filling their helmets and shields with rain while lightning struck the enemy. Everybody agreed a god had done it, and nobody agreed which one. The official version, carved onto the column that Marcus's son later put up in Rome, shows a vast winged and bearded rain god with water streaming from his outstretched arms. Dio's account credited an Egyptian magician in the emperor's retinue who summoned the god Hermes of the air. Christian writers within a generation were claiming that the legion contained Christian soldiers whose prayers had produced the storm, and that it was renamed the Thundering Legion because of it, which is impossible since the legion had carried that name for well over a century. What matters historically is not which explanation is true. It is that three different religious communities all immediately understood a rainstorm on the Danube as a message about who was protecting Rome, and that within 2 centuries one of those communities would be running the empire. In 175, the general Avidius Cassius, still commanding the entire Roman East, received a report that Marcus had died of illness on the frontier. He had himself proclaimed emperor in Egypt and Syria. Marcus, who was not dead, had to break off the German war and march east. The revolt lasted 3 months and 6 days, and was ended by a centurion who killed Cassius on his own initiative and brought the head to the emperor, who reportedly refused to look at it and had it buried. Marcus traveled east anyway, to show himself, and on the road, in a village in Cappadocia, his wife Faustina died after 30 years of marriage and at least 13 children. He went back to the Danube and died there, or near there, on the 17th of March, 180 AD, aged 58, most likely at the frontier headquarters at Vindobona. He left behind a private notebook, written in Greek, in the field. The heading of one section places it among the Quadi on the river Granua and another at Carnuntum. It was never meant for publication, and it contains no politics, no campaign narrative, and no self-justification, only a man repeatedly instructing himself to do his duty, to stop being angry at fools, to remember that everyone he was dealing with would soon be dead, including himself. It is the only document of its kind from antiquity, and it is the reason a Roman emperor is still read as a moral teacher 18 centuries later. So why did the Golden Age end? There are 4 serious explanations, and they do not exclude one another. The first is the succession argument, and it is the oldest. Machiavelli and Gibbon both concluded that the era worked because the throne was filled by adoption rather than birth, and collapsed the moment a biological son inherited. The problem with it is that the adoptive principle was never a principle. Nerva adopted Trajan because the Praetorians had a knife to his throat. Trajan may not have adopted Hadrian at all. Antoninus adopted Marcus because Hadrian ordered him to, and the 4 emperors who chose successors from outside their families all lacked living sons. Marcus had one and passed the empire to him. On this reading, the Golden Age was not a system. It was a demographic accident that ran out. The second is the fiscal and structural argument. Rome's finances had been built for 4 centuries on conquest, on plunder, indemnities, captives, and new tax bases arriving faster than costs. Dacia was the last conquest that genuinely paid, and it paid immediately and enormously. After Hadrian drew his lines, the empire had a fixed revenue base, a permanent standing army of several 100,000 men, and no more windfalls. From then on, every crisis had to be met from taxation, or from debasing the coinage, and the silver content of the denarius does in fact begin its long slide in exactly this period. The wall was strategically sound and fiscally terminal. The third is the plague argument. Some historians, working from Egyptian tax registers, army records, and the disappearance of names from documents, argue for mortality in the region of a fifth to a quarter of the population in affected areas, an economy stripped of its labor and its soldiers, at the precise moment it needed both. Others point out that the strongest evidence is local and patchy, that the ancient world had no way to distinguish one epidemic from another, and that Roman writers were prone to describing any bad year as unprecedented. The honest position is that the plague was real, serious, and of genuinely unknown scale. The fourth is climate. Ice cores, cave formations, tree rings, and lake sediments suggest that the 2 centuries around the birth of the empire were unusually warm, wet, and stable in the Mediterranean, which is very good for growing grain, and that this favorable regime destabilized from roughly the middle of the 2nd century, with drought in the east and colder conditions in the north. It is an attractive explanation, since the tribal movements on the Danube and the crop failures fall in the same window. Critics reply that the proxy records are coarse, that they disagree with each other regionally, and that explaining human decisions by weather is a way of avoiding the decisions. And there is a fifth position, which is that the question is wrong, because the Golden Age was never golden for most of the people inside it. Gibbon's famous verdict, that this was the period in the history of the world during which the human race was most happy and prosperous, was written by a man who identified with the Roman senatorial class and read its authors. From the other side of the frontier, it looks different. Tacitus, a senator who served under Trajan, put a speech in the mouth of a Caledonian chieftain about to fight the legions and had him say that the Romans made devastation and gave it the name of peace. Tacitus was inventing the speech, as ancient historians did, but he was a Roman insider and he chose to write that line, and he expected Roman readers to recognize something true in it. Ask a Dacian noble drinking poison in a burning fortress, or a woman hiding letters in a cave above the Dead Sea, whether they were living in the happiest age of mankind. Here is what is hardest to accept about all of it. Nobody living through the Golden Age knew they were in one, and nobody living through its ending knew that either. Trajan did not think he was reaching a maximum. He thought he was in the middle of a campaign, and he stood on the beach at the Persian Gulf, annoyed that he was too old to continue. Hadrian did not think he was ending Roman expansion forever. He thought he was consolidating an overextended front so that it could be held, which is what any competent officer would have thought. Antoninus did not think his 23 quiet years were the last quiet years. He thought they were normal. Marcus Aurelius, sitting in a tent on the Danube in the 11th year of a war he never finished, writing notes to himself about patience, believed he was managing an emergency, and every emergency in Roman memory had eventually been managed. Each of those judgments was reasonable. Each was made by an intelligent man with good information. And the sum of them was the moment the Roman Empire stopped growing, began paying for a permanent army out of a fixed income, lost an unknown fraction of its people to a disease it could not name, and started a war on the Danube that would, in one form or another, never really end. The people who built the road above the gorge and carved the emperor's name over it were not wrong to think it would outlast them. It did. What they could not see was that it would outlast the thing it was built to serve, which leaves one thread hanging, and it is the loudest one in the whole story. Marcus Aurelius had a son. Lucius Aurelius Commodus was born at Lanuvium in 161 AD, made joint emperor at 16, and inherited the world at 18. He was the first man in over a century to be born to the purple rather than chosen for it, the first emperor since the Flavians to succeed his own father, and he had grown up in an armed camp on a frozen river watching his father die by degrees. Within months of the funeral, he abandoned the German war, made terms, and went home to Rome. And over the following 12 years, he emptied the treasury his predecessors had filled, executed the senators who had raised him, renamed the months of the year and the city of Rome itself after his own titles, and went down into the arena to fight in front of the people as a gladiator, styling himself the reborn Hercules. He was strangled in his bath on the last day of 192 by his own wrestling partner, and the following year, 4 men claimed the throne, and the legions marched on Italy exactly as they had in 69. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. It genuinely means a lot. If you got something out of it, hit the like button and subscribe, because that is what decides whether the next one finds an audience. And here is the argument I actually want to have in the comments. If you had to name the single decision that ended Rome's golden age, which one do you pick? Was it Hadrian walking away from Trajan's conquests and turning an expanding empire into a besieged one? Was it Marcus Aurelius, the wisest man ever to hold the office, handing the world to his own son instead of the best man available? Or was it none of the above, because a plague and a changing climate and 400 years of frontier pressure would have broken it no matter who was wearing the purple? Make your case below, and I will see you in the next video.